Okay, are you still recovering from the golden calf incident? All right, so the people are still recovering from the golden calf incident. I mean, it was quite a lot that happened, not just the calf, right? So those pagan practices, bringing, sexuality into the practices of worship of false gods and things like that. That's the problem. Still recovering. Moses and the leadership of the community still recovering from the golden calf incident. God is still recovering from the golden calf incident. You might ask, how could that be? We're going to find out. So we're into Exodus number 33. Can you believe that? Chapter 33. Somebody commented, your handout includes most of chapter 34. I didn't staple the other page to it. I thought that's way too ambitious. There's so much in chapter 33. Hopefully we'll just get to, pull back the tent flap and peek into chapter 34. No guarantees, but let's see where we can go. But remember the scene last we visited our ancestors of faith there, still at the foot of Mount Sinai, still recovering from the debacle of the golden calf. And here at the very beginning, you'll be relieved to know God does restate God's promise, promised land, which was first promised in Genesis chapter 12 and 15 to Abraham and Sarah. So we'll dive right in. Verse 1, Exodus 33. Here we are. The Lord said to Moses, "Go, leave this place, you and the people whom you have brought out of Egypt. And go to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it." Now the people must start out again. They're going to make another journey. I wonder how you might be feeling, still hungover from this sinful parade that you were part of. And now you got to leave where you've been almost a year. Since Egypt, you really hadn't camped anywhere this long. So how would you feel? I would think they're disappointed to leave Mount Sinai in that valley there. I would think they may be a little bit frustrated. I mean, change is difficult for everyone, right? Who wants change? Only a baby, right? Dirty baby. Yeah. So change is always difficult for people, and they've been there for nearly a year. So this is, God is saying something to them they may have not anticipated. Now you have to leave. But he's saying where? You're going to a promised land. Verse 2, I will send an angel before you. I will drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Wow, it's a lot of ites. No termites mentioned, by the way. Still haven't driven out the termites. I'm going to look at the word angel because, this shows up from time to time. And in Hebrew, malach is the word. Simply means a messenger sent by God. In this case, likely one of the Israelite leaders. It doesn't say, it's not to look like an angel like we might think of Gabriel, but probably a regular person and not referring to Moses, perhaps. Maybe this is, Jason's intuition or thought process as I was looking through the commentaries. It could be a veiled way of pointing to Joshua. Joshua gets mentioned just a little bit and then a little bit more, not clearly named yet as Moses' successor, but we know, because most of us, reading forward in the Bible history, Joshua does come next and lead them into the promised land, not Moses himself. So again, we think about this driving out of other people who were indigenous to that region or living in that region before the Hebrew people. What's happening here? It often seems morally troubling to us for God to tell them to drive out, but it's God who will drive out these other people. Elsewhere in the Torah, we have, references or ways that God describes the Canaanites as evil. So these are people who become bent on violence and war, primitive pagan practices, which we've talked about. So it's only as they deserve to be driven out because of their violence and their paganism and refusal to believe in the one God. So there are those justifications. But let's read on because milk and honey is promised. Anybody have that for breakfast? Anybody? I have a little honey on my toast sometimes. It's good stuff. The Bible includes a lot of good food, by the way. Just mention it. So the land of milk and honey. It's verse 3, a promise or imagery that indicates God's provision. But not only that, I mean, compared to the wilderness and that sort of, like stale crackers manna, this is a blessing indeed. Just the promise of milk and honey should whet their appetites, should get them excited about getting up and going again. It's interesting that God doesn't use words like holy land, doesn't describe the promised land as the holy, like the holy. The land is not holy itself. It actually is incumbent upon the people. God is the holy God, and the people have been shown this right way to live, so they should be a holy people. And it's their presence, God's presence and the presence of holy people, that will make holy what we call the Holy Land. So that's not the description that God begins with. He starts talking about a land of milk and honey. One Jewish scholar I read had written, "Our nation is only a nation by virtue of the Torah," which is very interesting to remember. This holiness comes from the revealed Word of God. So again, it's not so much that the people are special, but that God has given them a special way. And again, everything is accomplished in the Bible through the gift of language. Intelligible speech is what makes us in the likeness of God, the ability to reason and understand, to think and to act morally, to follow what God is teaching. And these all are, when you think about it, like the words that I'm speaking right now, you can't see them, right? But we understand that God spoke everything into being, that God accomplishes creation through a holy conversation, and everything responds. So when we think about spring and we think about flowers springing up, it's a response to God speaking all of this into being. And so are our words a response. And we are known, in God's people in the Old Testament, known by the Torah or by the words more distinctly than anything else. Not that Jews are a people distinguished by their ethnicity. There are Jews in virtually every ethnic category on earth now, right? So that's not the point either. They are defined by their belief, the moral path that God shows them, and the Torah, the words that God gave them. And certainly they have failed, just as we as Christians, we fail. They start their journey of freedom and they stumble and they fall flat on their faces, but God gives them words of forgiveness and another chance. It's really amazing. So God says, verse 3, go up to a land of flowing with milk and honey. So there's that flowing, that abundance. But then look at this next part of verse 3. I will not go up among you. So remember the consequences of sin. We've talked about that. God is with them, but God is not going to go with them in that most intimate way as they may have thought, like when they were coming out of Egypt, the pillar of fire. God explains why this change. Remember, still recovering from that golden calf incident. Otherwise, I would consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. So the promise is stated, but then God seems to change God's tone a little bit here. Still a little anger, still a little frustration. But God is a promise keeper. That's really the point here. Verse 4, when the people heard these harsh words, they mourned, and no one put on ornaments, that is jewelry. Isn't this interesting? Okay, hold on. Keep reading. The Lord had said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. That word again. We went through that word. If you don't remember, they are not humble. They will not bow. Their neck is as if it's stiff, and they won't humble themselves. All right. I should, verse 4, say to the Israelites, you're a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, jewelry, and I will decide what to do to you. Ooh, that's kind of a scary phrase. We'll talk about this in a minute. Now the Israelites stripped themselves of their ornaments. Oh, this seems to me to be a story, kind of a reversal of what happened when they came out of Egypt and they asked for and received the gold jewelry and they put it on. And now they are asked to leave Mount Sinai and asked to take that off. Of course, part of me thinks, didn't they melt a lot of that for the golden calf? I don't know how big the golden calf was. I don't know how much jewelry people were left with. But here they take it off. Why? It would seem to me to be an act of repentance. it appears to be a way of showing God, no, we're not stiff-necked, we're actually contrite at heart, and we'll give up this jewelry, because obviously God is showing us the consequences of sin, so the people need to respond. Why? Well, look at verse 5, that I may know what to do with you. I kind of hung on those words a little bit. It does sound like that angry parent. Maybe you've been that parent, maybe you've been the recipient, that child, where the parent says, I'm still deciding what your punishment will be. We're going to start with grounding you for 2 weeks, or, you don't have the car anymore. But I'm not finished yet. Let me have some time to deliberate. It's just like when you go to court. Sentencing doesn't happen on the same day, right? Usually it takes a little time. Judge needs to think on some things, what have you. Let's read on. The tent of meeting. So the scene shifts here, and we get these little episodic images. So here we have this wonderful image of Moses and his relationship with God again. Now this is important, I think, in the flow of the whole drama, because you see God is angry. You see the punishment. Last chapter, thousands of the perpetrators died for their immoral sexual practices in the pagan worship of the golden calf. And now Moses, you really see Moses in the role of high priest, in the sense of even on a daily basis, present in the community in what they call the tent of meetings. Let's read about it. Verse 7. Moses used to take the tent, pitch it outside the camp, far enough from the camp. He called it the tent of meeting. Everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise and stand, each of them at the entrance of their tents, and watch Moses until he had gone to the tent. So you kind of get this sense, almost like a judge, when you are in a courtroom and the judge walks in, all rise, right? So it's important. Where I work, I might wear the black robe, but it's really the first hymn that it's the music that gets people to rise. But anyway, for Moses, it didn't even need the music, evidently. All right, just a little fun there. You'll laugh later. Okay, verse 9, Moses entered the tent, pillar of cloud. Now, here's the pillar of cloud again, but it's around Moses. Not for the people who are leading the whole community, but Moses' leadership role. So this does signal to the people that God is still with Moses. And so again, it probably heightens their respect for him, even fear, perhaps, because of all that's just happened, the death of thousands of their brothers and sisters. All right, probably more brothers, but anyway. Moses entered the tent, pillar of cloud descends, stands at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. Verse 10, when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow down, all of them at the entrance of their tent. So this is an act of worship. The bow down part is literally where we get the word worship. So again, they are showing themselves not to be stiff-necked, but contrite of heart, repentant. Thus the Lord, verse 11, used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. I mean, just that sentence alone. I mean, sometimes you just stop in reading and you think about the sort of the devotional depth of a sentence like that, and you can put that into your own prayer life. Yeah, it's about Moses, but it's also about God, a God who's willing, even after great sin, God who is willing to be up close and personal. Then he would return to the camp, but his young assistant Joshua, see, there's the cameo appearance again. We keep getting these little snapshots. Joshua, he would not leave the tent. So Joshua was just right there, like Moses' right-hand man. God wanted him in, just like Aaron. Where's Aaron? So Aaron has been very close to Moses. Now Joshua, this younger man, being groomed for leadership is the intent. Now, this is a story about Moses and the relationship Moses has with God. So understand that Moses and God were as tight, as close as any human being. The images of God's presence around this, the phrase face to face, they all point to Moses living in direct relationship, in the direct presence of God. No closer, no other human being in the Bible other than Jesus is shown to be as close to God as this. So let me just check one thing. I think it's also a reminder of Moses' leadership status as, we're actually finishing up these last images or episodes in the book of Exodus. So it reminds us of the stature of Moses. In a sense, the tent of meeting and the way it's described and the cloud around it is a way of bringing the top of the mountain down to the community of people in the valley. And as they go forward, you get the sense that that close presence of God from the top of the Mount Sinai, where you get the Ten Commandments, is attached to Moses then. So it's a very powerful scene. And Moses intercedes. So there's certainly worship in this sense. It's a prayer story. That's what we read next. Moses as priest, speaking the words, the prayers, the needs of the people up to God. Verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, "See, you have said to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight." Verse 13, very important. Look at this. "Now, if I found favor in your sight, show me your ways, so that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people." Moses first reminds God that these people are God's own people. God, in the encounter and accountability scene in chapter 33, where God is obviously angry, and Moses finds out the people are in revelry. They're not worshiping God. They're worshiping a false god. They're acting like pagans. So, Moses hears God's language saying, "Moses, these are your people." Not too different from one angry parent saying to the other, "That's your son who made this mess." So Moses again reminds God. So this is a couple of times Moses has taken on the role of intercessory prayer, or praying as a priest, the prayers, the needs of the people. "Show me your ways" is a phrase that I underlined there in verse 13. What a prayer. "Show me your ways, O God, so that I may know you." That could be a prayer for any one of us on any day, right? So I lift that up. Again, Moses is invested in a close relationship with God, and as much as Moses has accomplished, as long as Moses has been walking with God and trusting God, even at least the first episode of the Ten Commandments has been achieved. I mean, he broke the tablets because the people broke the commands, but think about all of this, that Moses could be, in some ways sort of complacent now or resting on his laurels. No, Moses is still in this deep prayer. "Show me your ways that I may know you," because Moses knows the mantle of leadership has yet to depart from him. So this is very important. Verse 14, he said, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." That's God speaking to Moses. "And he said to him, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here." So Moses is concerned about God's lingering anger and whether or not God's truly going to be with him and with the people. "I don't want to go any further than we are now if you're not going to take us, O Lord," is Moses' idea here. But look at verse 16. "How shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight? I and your people," Moses reminds God again, "unless you go with us. In this way, we shall be distinct, I and your people, from every people on the face of the earth." So remember, we tend to think of the word holy as some churchy word, some special word. That may be for other people, not for. It literally means distinct, set apart, different from, in the ways that we believe, live, act, speak, and the practices or habits that we keep, whether it's going to church or a Bible study like this, or just your daily devotions and your interactions with other people. It's so that others may know that there is one God and you are a follower, different from others. You are a follower of the one true God, and knowing God's ways, putting those ways into practice in your life. So all of that is at stake here. Moses is wonderful. He's got the heart of his people on his heart, but he also has a heart for the bigger purpose. God, when you do this, it's to witness to the whole world, It's so that the world may know, is a phrase repeated even in the New Testament. All right, so it's about relationship with God and what we can learn from Moses today. I hope you haven't missed this very simple point. Sometimes the most simple are the most significant points to remember. Relationship with God involves continuing conversation. Keep the conversation going. Keep prayers going. I'd say even, how about especially when times are hard? Even when we've sinned. No, especially when you sin. Keep the conversation going with God. If God, you think, is angry at, or I sat with this person after worship the other day who described a time when she was so angry with God. She said, I don't think I've ever used that kind of language with God before. And she had mixed feelings about it. I understand. By the way, one of the strange gifts, emotions or feelings, that God gives us is we rarely have one emotion at a time. You ever notice that? How we may have anger, then immediately we have guilt about our anger. Or, I wish I hadn't said, it's like the toothpaste. Once you get it out of the tube, you can't put it back. You understand. Your words are that way, your feelings are that way. Anyway, relationship involves that even when you're angry at God, or especially when you're angry with God, give voice to it. Yes, that's the witness of these scriptures. Abraham, Moses, King David, a lot of the Psalms. Read Psalm 13, read Psalm 88 if you need some more corroborating evidence. Prayer is our continuing conversation with God. Prayer is the link to God. It keeps us connected. Verse 17, speaking of that, the Lord said to Moses, I will do everything you've asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. There's that relationship. I know you by name. You've found favor. In other words, I love you. And that's not the language the Old Testament uses very much, but we can understand it that way. My blessing is upon you. Favor in your sight. That sort of thing. Most importantly, I want you to pay attention to that first part of verse 17. God says this to Moses. I will do everything that you have asked. Sometimes we wonder, what does it mean to pray? I mean, if I ask for something in prayer, am I actually asking God to do something for me? Yes. Could I possibly change God's mind? Let's think about that. We've talked about it a little bit, but this verse brings it into focus, doesn't it? Does God change God's mind? And does prayer have a role in changing God's mind? And I would say yes, but here's the deeper explanation, because you know this. People who do a deep thinking faith, one word answers rarely suffice, right? So let's unpack it a little bit. Let's talk about this, because it's a lingering question so many of us ask. First, it would seem we have to say that God does not change. I mean, isn't that one of the best qualities of God? Is that God just doesn't change with the times. God is as he was yesterday, today, tomorrow, that sort of thing. Yes, in God's essence. But the scriptures do give us examples that God changes God's mind from time to time. Listen to this. It's not to say that God makes mistakes, but God does change God's mind. Why? Well, evidently, it's this relationship piece. I mean, God started everything as a relationship. The universe, the earth, all the creatures and the beautiful things that God put on the earth, God's in relationship with, and human beings especially. God cares about us so much, loves us so much, cares about our relationship so much that he's listening to all of our prayers, and God actually answers our prayers. Of course, as you've heard me say before, sometimes those answers are no. We don't want to hear that. Sometimes we may not believe that. We maybe think that God's being angry or mean. Sometimes the answers are yes. In this case, God gave Moses just what he asked for. It's amazing, but it's the power of prayer. And it's the kind of God who says, yes, I will be involved in relationship with human beings, so much so that the power of prayer may turn God in a certain direction. Jesus certainly prayed with this example, right? Jesus prayed in a way that he trusted that God was listening and that God would answer or listen and perhaps change. Yes, it's the interpersonal nature of our God. So what we learn from prayer or these examples in the scripture is God is not the unmovable mover of philosophical language like Aristotle taught about the unmoved mover, but God is actually a movable mover. God is an actionable character or deity that exists and is in interactive ways with us, so willing to change. Prayer is powerful. Prayer is worth doing. Here's another prayer. So it's amazing. Moses prays for favor in God's sight, receives the answer to that prayer, and he doesn't go and like, all right, take a day off and play a round of golf. You know, I don't know for sure that golf was in the Old Testament. We'll get back to that. What does he do? Immediately, Moses prays again. Listen to this prayer. Might be one of the best prayers of all Scripture. Verse 18, Moses said, "Show me your glory, I pray." Such a beautiful prayer. I don't know about you, but numerous songs of our faith kind of float up within me when I hear that. Show me your glory. And at the answer to that prayer is right away at verse 19. God says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Yahweh." So, I mean, it's as close and personal a relationship as you can see in the Scriptures. It's so powerful. So God is right in there with Moses in conversation and in answering prayer. So if you can just pause for a minute and think about that scene. Think about Moses. In this case, he's back on top of the mountain. He's in an intimate prayer conversation with God. And just try to imagine God saying this: "I will make all my goodness pass before you and proclaim before you the name of the Lord," which specifically God himself says, Yahweh. "I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." The Lord continued, "See, there is a place by me where you stand. You shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by," verse 22, "I'll put you in the cleft of the rock. And I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not see." One of the songs that just comes to my mind is "Rock of Ages," cleft for me. I mean, just that phrase in there, and where God just kind of hid Moses in there and showed him as much as he could stand, as much as he could bear as a mortal. So you understand, I think, what an amazing story. But I think you understand the ancient understanding. It's not like written as a standalone verse, but it goes all the way back in Genesis. It was in other primitive cultures, not just the Israelite history here. The basic understanding was to see God's face meant you would die. God is so holy, we are not holy. Mortal human being cannot stand in the face of God's awesome glory and holiness, so you would die. This is an amazing thing that God would let Moses get this close. And God does guard God's own face. You'll not see that. You'll see my back. There's something to that. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But I want to go back to the word glory. So we have this wonderful story, this image that God's revealing more of God's self or God's essence to Moses than anyone else other than Jesus. What a relationship of trust and faith. But what is it to say, "Show me your glory"? What was it that Moses was actually asking for? Your glory. So I asked a group of people, now they weren't set up for this question. It wasn't a Bible study. It was a group of, maybe 6 people from my church. And I shared this Bible verse as an opening prayer to our meeting. And I said, well, what is glory? And boy, I couldn't have had more disinterested faces and a calmer silence. I'd never heard at that meeting before. As we all just kind of thought, well, what is glory? And I'm not picking on them, because I think most of us probably feel that way. And it's not a bad response to the word glory, because we struggle to define it. And that's a good thing. So first, keep that sense of awe. Like, how do you feel when you see a shooting star? There's just this sense that, oh, wow, that's really special. And it's hard to articulate why. But all of a sudden, you kind of know your place. In the vast scheme of things, who am I? Psalm 8, right? When I look at the heavens, who am I that God even thinks of me? Because God is so much greater than it. So glory has a bit of that essence to it. Another word for it might be, show me your essence, your personality, your character. Maybe we would use the word character if that connects better with you. What are the essential qualities of God? That may be what Moses is after here. Moses, the one who at the burning bush, in that moment of awe, says, who am I talking with? Who am I speaking with? He wanted to get God's name. Now Moses wants to go yet a step further in personal acquaintance with God. Yes, show me your glory. Show me that quality of heart that is your very essence. So how God responds, I think, is so powerful, so important for us to pay attention to. God says, I'll show you all my goodness. Oh, yes, the essence of God is good. God is good. We say that, right? We understand that. But what about it? Well, all of this goodness implies the characteristics of God's person, God's heart. It means God's actions. We know God through, in a sense, if you want to see God's face, you should see how he acts. The way God acts and speaks shows us God's heart and God's character. So what actually did happen, by the way? Moses, hidden in the cleft of the rock, peeking out, maybe one eyeball. I imagine him with really long hair, okay, like a grandfather figure. And so you could just barely see one eye kind of peeking out from the, I don't know how that actually happened. And what did he see? Was it a shining bright cloud that passed along the summit of the mountain there? Maybe infused with lightning or static electricity or something. I don't know. I'm just trying to paint the picture for you. Just try to imagine that scene. And Moses must have been in awe. Was the mountain at that time a little bit volcanic? Was it like, maybe trembling like that? Or is it thunder? I don't know. I'm enthralled by this scene, and we just don't get enough information. I always want more information where the Bible is a little quiet. And sometimes it shares so much information, like the details of the breastplate of the high priest. Okay, I know that was important then, not as important to me now. I want to know what happened with God. Okay, to see God face to face. Often when an angel appears in the Old Testament, this presence of God, the angel uses a phrase, "It's too wonderful for you to know the name of the angel that Jacob wrestled with." He says, too wonderful for you. To see God's face is too wonderful. There must be some mystery. How do you receive mystery from God or the Bible? Or in your own prayer life? Are you okay to allow mystery to just kind of sit with you and not entirely see God's face like Moses? Was he disappointed in this, or was he just so blessed to receive just the little bit that God would show him? There has to be some mystery in the scriptures, in our faith, in our understanding, because as Paul would say, not yet. Now we see through a glass dimly. Only then we'll see face to face. Same with Moses. He still didn't quite see all that he wanted to see. But what a grace, what a mercy, what a gift of a close relationship with God that he got as much as he got. Right? That's just a powerful thing. So one last big point in this scene and in chapter 33. So God doesn't show Moses the front of God's face, recognition, character, whatever. But as I pass by, then you can kind of look as my glory goes past you. It seems like in that episode, there is this understanding or an implicit teaching. In other words, we might realize that we know God not so much from what's promised for the future, although a lot of us would love. Wouldn't we love to have a faith fortune teller so that we could pick the right stocks today or understand how to manage our retirement portfolio better? That would just make us all so happy. We would love to know a God that would show us this sort of faith fortune teller to let us know how our grandchildren, they're going to marry well, right? They're going to end up going to church again someday, won't they? We want to know these things, right? But we don't get so much of God in that forward movement. But we see so much more of God, and we know God so personally after he's passed by. When we see, look at the past, and you can know God well today by looking at how God acted in the past. And that God kept his promises to Moses and those early believers of the faith shows us that's God's essence. God's glory is that you also will find favor in his sight. God's glory is showing us that, hey, if he kept his promises to them then, God will keep his promises to us now. This is good news. This is showing us God's glory, and we can see God's heart, even though there's still mystery and we can't see face to face, and we don't know how God's going to answer those prayers when we put them out there. Okay. Hope that helps. Hope you enjoyed being on top of the mountain one more time with Moses and the glory of God. Because now there's work to do, right? Chapter 34. Let's turn the page. Now for the rest of the story. Okay. Replacing the tablets of the 10 Commandments. They were broken. Moses didn't make the golden calf, but he did make it down the mountain with those tablets that he threw on the ground, right? And smashed them. So, interesting. God assembled the first 2 stone tablets. Now, God's saying to Moses, well, you need some skin in the game here, buddy. All right, you're going to carve out these next 2. I'll still write it with my finger, what I want to write on there. But you're going to have to put yourself to work. So, verse 1, chapter 34. The Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the previous ones. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets, which you broke. I just can hear God say, put a little tone on it. All right, we're having fun with this, but I think it's scriptural. Verse 2, be ready in the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. We're going up one more time, aren't we? I told you there was a lot of up and down in Exodus, so it's hard to keep up. Verse 3, no one shall come up with you. This is reminiscent to the other adventures going up the mountain where we've heard about this before. So again, it's Moses and God, and this time for the 10 Commandments, part 2, right? Okay. Do not let anyone be seen throughout all the mountain. Do not let the flocks or herds graze in front of that mountain. So it's, this is God and Moses' business. Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the former ones. He rose early in the morning. That phrase, when you hear that, early in the morning, that's about commitment. That's about faithfulness. And it's always, I think, a good thing to start our mornings with our commitment to God. So he rose early in the morning, went up on Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone, which the Lord, and then the Lord descended in the cloud, and stood with him there. Now, again, these phrases, sometimes I just want to pause. It's such a powerful thought, and try to imagine that. The Lord descended in the cloud, stood with him there. I mean, that's just a beautiful thing. Again, the closeness of God and Moses. And again, this phrase, proclaim the name the Lord. Again, this is from God, that we understand God's most personal, like if we were going to say first name, or maybe even nickname, although I don't want to cheapen it, I don't want to sound sacrilegious. But when you are close with a person, you may have a very intimate name that you call that person. Maybe nobody else does. And God says God's own name, Yahweh. And that's such a special, powerful name. Again, it's often written the Lord, because from the beginning, people of faith didn't want to utter that name as much, to keep it holy, to keep it so special. And so they use names like El, or God, we say, or Adonai, Lord, translated Lord, instead of saying Yahweh. But God himself says it, so that lends, a deeper meaning to it. It gives more credibility to the use of that name. And if you recall, nobody really knows what it means. So you can go back as far back as you can, reading the rabbis or all these scholars on this. It's an approximation of the sound of your own breath. Yahweh. This breathing in, breathing out. Why? Because when God created the first human beings, God breathed God's breath. So you could say every time you breathe, which many of you, you do that without even being conscious of it, right? We are breathing every day, thousands of times, whispering God's name with every breath. So you're in that close a relationship with God. Just think about the air in your lungs, inside out all the time. Spirit and world connected. God, creator and creation connected in that Simple act of breathing. God made us that way. He didn't have to make us that way, but he made us that way with his own breath, unlike the other creatures. God breathed his breath into us. So it's God's Spirit. Think of it that way. All right, let's look at verse 5 again. I'm just going to read it again because it's so powerful. It connects now with the next section. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name Yahweh. So after God says this, you have this sort of set off like verses, almost like poetry. Alex, can I borrow your page? Let me just make sure I got all the words right because I copied it on mine and I think I'm missing a couple of words. So look at verse 6 at the beginning. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious. So the first thing that strikes me, I wanted to read this all the way through. I'm going to give it back to you just a second. I keep interrupting myself. Of course, you're used to me. Most of you have been here before. Okay. Thanks be to God. It's interesting to hear God praise God. I mean, God can do what God wants to. So I'm not complaining about that. It's just, this is different. This is set off from the narrative. It's like poetry. It's God's own soliloquy, if you will. It's very spiritual. And what I'm about to read, this little section of verses, it's verse 6 and 7, but it's set off like poetry in about 4 or 5 different stanzas, depending on how your English translators put it out there. The point being, this is a set of verses, like lyrics. These lyrics are repeated throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, more frequently than any other lyric or poetic phrase. And these are God's own words about God's own essence. So when Moses said, show me your glory, we get this scene that we can only try to imagine some sort of glorious presence of God, like physically and emotionally, spiritually, at the same time actually happening, passing close to Moses physically. But now we get that glory defined by God's own self-revelation, self-description. God's, in a sense, using very careful language to put his CV, his resume, out there for you to read and to accept. So here it is. The Lord passed before Moses, and the Lord speaks. Again, the importance of words. This is God speaking. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and forgiveness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Thanks. How's that strike you? Started off really good, but could we skip that last little part? Is my first response to that. But that's God. Okay? And let's unpack it a little bit. Let's talk about it. Probably not surprising to you, but what good news to hear that God is compassionate, that God is gracious, merciful, that God is slow to anger. Wait, do you believe it? Just a chapter ago, weren't there thousands of people killed for their sinfulness? Yes, God is slow to anger. But wait a minute, he was still kind of recovering from that sinful debacle of the golden calf and all that pagan practice. God's still angry, like the day after, still angry. Have you ever had that in the family, maybe where somebody gives you the cold shoulder for a while, or maybe still yelling at you for something that you did 20 minutes ago or 20 years? Not to bring up anything specific. Is God slow to anger? Can we say that? Yes, we can say it truthfully. God is slow to anger. We read but a few episodes of a few people. What does God see? God sees the whole world and all of humanity. And who misbehaves more? Well, human beings do. I mean, and like children or parents or all human beings tend to go astray, right? And fail and sin and do. So if God were angry about every single sin out there, well, God would be quick to anger and justifiably so, right? So we do have a God who is patient. Thank God he's slow to anger. Abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping God's promises generation after generation, God says himself, to the 1,000th generation. Now, I think the reason for that language, not so much the number 1,000, but for people in that primitive culture without the concept of mathematics like we have, 1,000 was like the biggest number they had. They didn't have billion, zillion, whatever it is the government budget is now, quintillion, I don't know. But that's where I hear the biggest numbers, generally speaking, from budget office. These numbers, they didn't have that high a number, but God could have said that. God could have said, do the trillionth amount. It's supposed to be so impressive. Like nobody could count that high. Like when Jesus said, forgive your brother 70 times 7. The disciples, they didn't have an abacus. They couldn't have done that on their fingers. They just didn't know. They just do it until you can't count anymore and keep doing it some more. That good thing called forgiveness. And God is like that with God's blessings. This is the goodness of God. This is the glory of God. This is the essence of God's character. Speaking of character. So, then it is this section of, visit the iniquities upon the children to the 4th generation. Well, what I would say is contrast 4th generation to the 1,000th. And the numbers are nowhere near, right? So God's goodness and blessing and mercy and forgiveness is so much greater than God's judgment, is one way to read that. So I think what we have in God's own self-revelation, his glory involves both and understanding of who God is. God is both merciful and a God of justice. God shows anger, but also forgiveness. So there's both judgment and mercy. And as you hear later in the scriptures, mercy triumphs over judgment. Aren't we thankful for that? I mean, every one of us. Good news. That's good news. So ultimately we see in these scenes of chapters 33 and 34, we're not going to get through all of 34. I want some time for question and answers. But what we see is God's self as up close and personal as you can get, in the Old Testament right now. This is some powerful self-description of God's own heart, God's own character. Thank God for Moses being as strong a leader as he is, as tenacious a person to be in close relationship with God, so we can be up close and personal with God as well. So when we think about God's glory, think about God's goodness. All right, thoughts, comments, questions? Anybody? Yeah, quiet room today.